The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and I watched my marriage dissolve in real time. 4 years of what I thought was a solid relationship crumbled with one sentence that I screamed during our worst fight. "You were just my backup plan until Derek came back." Ryan's face went completely white. He was holding our wedding photo that he'd picked up during our argument about trust and honesty, and I watched his grip tighten until I thought the glass might crack. The silence that followed my outburst was deafening, not the kind of quiet that comes before making up, but the kind that signals the end of everything you thought you knew about your life. He set the photo down carefully on our coffee table, his movements precise and controlled, in a way that scared me more than if he'd thrown it against the wall. When he finally looked at me, his brown eyes held an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something worse. Complete and utter disillusionment. Ryan asked me to repeat what I'd just said, his voice eerily calm. I tried to backtrack, to explain that I'd spoken in anger, that I didn't mean it the way it sounded, but the damage was already done. He looked at me like I was a stranger he'd accidentally let into his house, someone who'd been wearing a mask for 4 years and had finally revealed their true face. Within an hour, Ryan had packed a single suitcase with methodical efficiency. He didn't slam doors or raise his voice. He simply moved through our home like he was checking out of a hotel, gathering his essentials, while I followed him from room to room, desperately trying to explain myself. He told me he was going to stay with his parents and that he needed time to think about what I'd revealed. I begged him not to leave, insisted that my words had been nothing more than cruel things said in the heat of the moment. But Ryan just shook his head sadly and told me that people don't lie about something that fundamental unless there's truth behind it. He said 4 years was a long time to be someone's backup plan without knowing it. The next morning, a courier delivered divorce papers to our front door. Ryan had apparently spent the night at his lawyer's office instead of his parents' house, moving with a speed and determination that left me reeling. The papers cited irreconcilable differences, but there was a handwritten note attached that cut deeper than any legal document could. "I hope Derek is worth losing someone who actually loved you." That's when the full weight of what I'd destroyed began to sink in. Ryan hadn't just been hurt by my confession, he'd been fundamentally changed by it. The man who'd spent 4 years trying to make me happy, who'd built his entire future around our life together, had realized that I'd been settling for him while secretly hoping for someone else to return. My name is Melissa. I'm 28 years old, and I met Ryan 5 years ago when I was in the worst emotional state of my life. I'd just ended a 2-year relationship with Derek Martinez, a relationship that had been as passionate as it was destructive. Derek was everything that romance novels promise and real life rarely delivers. Devastatingly handsome, unpredictably exciting, and completely incapable of commitment. Derek had been my college boyfriend, the kind of man who could make me forget my own name with a single look across a crowded room. He was pursuing a graduate degree in architecture while working part-time at a trendy downtown restaurant, and everything about him seemed designed to make women lose their minds. He had this way of making me feel like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met, but only when it suited him. Our relationship had been a constant cycle of incredible highs and devastating lows. Derek would disappear for days without explanation, then show up at my apartment with flowers and apologies that made me forget why I'd been angry. He'd make plans with me and then cancel at the last minute because something more interesting had come up. He'd tell me he loved me, then act like we were just friends when we were around other people. The end had come when I discovered he'd been seeing someone else for months. Not just casually, but seriously enough that he'd introduced her to his family while telling me he wasn't ready for that level of commitment. When I'd confronted him, Derek had simply shrugged and said he'd never promised me exclusivity, that I'd assumed things he'd never actually said. I'd been devastated, not just heartbroken, but completely shattered in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about love and relationships. For 2 years, I'd rearranged my entire life around someone who'd never considered me more than a convenient option among many. That's the state I was in when I met Ryan at a mutual friend's housewarming party. While everyone else was drinking and laughing and playing party games, I was sitting in a corner, nursing a single glass of wine and trying not to check Derek's social media profiles on my phone. Ryan had approached me with genuine concern, asking if I was okay and offering to get me some water or something to eat. Ryan was everything Derek wasn't. Steady, thoughtful, genuinely interested in my well-being rather than just his own entertainment. He was 26, worked as a financial advisor at a respected firm downtown, and had the kind of quiet confidence that came from actually having his life together rather than just pretending he did. We'd spent the entire evening talking about books, travel dreams, and our shared frustration with the shallow dating culture that seemed to dominate our generation. Ryan listened when I spoke, asked follow-up questions, and seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about everything from local politics to restaurant recommendations. When he'd asked for my number at the end of the night, it had felt natural rather than predatory. Ryan was everything Derek wasn't. He showed up when he said he would, remembered important dates, and never made me wonder if he really wanted me. Our early dates were refreshingly straightforward. Dinner conversations that lasted for hours, weekend hikes where we talked about our childhoods and career goals, movie nights where he actually watched the film instead of trying to distract me from it. The contrast with my previous relationship was so stark that I sometimes felt like I was dating someone from a different species. Where Derek had been unpredictable and exciting, Ryan was reliable and comforting. Where Derek had made me feel like I was competing for his attention, Ryan made me feel like I was the only person in the room who mattered to him. Within 6 months, we were practically living together. Ryan had a beautiful apartment in a safe neighborhood, and he'd given me a key without me having to ask for one. He'd cleared space in his closet for my clothes, stocked his bathroom with products I used, and started planning weekend activities around things he knew I enjoyed. The relationship progressed with a kind of comfortable inevitability that felt nothing like the emotional roller coaster I'd experienced with Derek. Ryan introduced me to his family after 4 months, and they'd welcomed me with a warmth that still makes me emotional to remember. His parents treated me like a daughter from our first meeting, and his younger sister immediately started planning double dates with her boyfriend. When Ryan proposed after 18 months together, it had been exactly what I'd expected: thoughtful, romantic, and perfectly timed. He'd taken me to the restaurant where we'd had our first official date, presented me with a ring he'd clearly put considerable thought into choosing, and told me he couldn't imagine building a future with anyone else. I'd said yes without hesitation, genuinely believing that this was what mature, stable love looked like. Our wedding had been everything Derek would have mocked: traditional, family-focused, and carefully planned down to the smallest detail. Ryan had been involved in every decision, from the venue selection to the menu tasting, and his enthusiasm for creating the perfect day had been infectious. Walking down the aisle toward him, I'd felt incredibly fortunate to be marrying someone who was so obviously committed to making me happy. The first 3 years of our marriage had been blissfully peaceful. Ryan had been promoted twice at his firm. We'd bought a beautiful house in a neighborhood we both loved, and we'd settled into a routine that felt sustainable and satisfying. We'd traveled together, hosted dinner parties for our friends, and started talking seriously about having children. But somewhere in the back of my mind, Derek had never really disappeared. I'd kept tabs on him through social media, watching from a distance as he continued his pattern of casual relationships and career changes. He'd moved to Seattle after graduation, then to Portland, then to Denver, always chasing some new opportunity or adventure that never seemed to pan out the way he'd hoped. While Ryan planned our anniversary dinners, I was stalking Derek's Instagram, wondering if he ever thought about me. I told myself it was just curiosity about an old friend, but the truth was more complicated. Part of me had never stopped waiting for Derek to realize what he'd lost, to come back and fight for me the way he never had when we were actually together. I loved Ryan, of course I did. He was kind, stable, generous, and completely devoted to our relationship. But sometimes, usually late at night when he was sleeping peacefully beside me, I'd wonder if what we had was really love or just a very comfortable arrangement between two people who were tired of being alone. The passion I'd felt with Derek had been destructive, but it had also been intoxicating in a way that my relationship with Ryan had never been. With Derek, I'd felt alive, electric, constantly on edge in ways that were both thrilling and exhausting. With Ryan, I felt safe, cherished, and completely secure, but I also sometimes felt like I was sleepwalking through my own life. Then, 4 months ago, Derek had returned to Minneapolis. He'd reached out through Facebook Messenger with a casual note about being back in town and wondering if I'd like to grab coffee to catch up. The message had appeared on my phone while Ryan and I were having breakfast, and I'd nearly choked on my coffee reading it. Ryan had asked if I was okay, and I'd made some excuse about work stress, while my heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and panic. I should have deleted the message. I should have told Ryan about it immediately. Instead, I'd found myself staring at Derek's profile photos, noting how the years had been kind to him, how his architectural work had taken him to beautiful cities and given him experiences that looked impossibly glamorous compared to my suburban married life. Derek had included his phone number in the message, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop downtown that had been one of our old hangouts. The casual tone of his invitation made it seem innocent enough, just two old friends catching up after years apart. But the way my pulse quickened reading his words told me that nothing about seeing Derek again would be innocent. I'd waited 3 days before responding, crafting and deleting dozens of replies before settling on something that matched his casual tone. I'd suggested meeting the following Saturday afternoon, when Ryan would be playing golf with his college friends. I told myself it was just coffee, just a chance to get closure on a relationship that had ended badly years ago. Derek looked exactly the same when I walked into the coffee shop that Saturday. Same dark hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it. Same green eyes that seemed to see right through whatever facade I was presenting to the world. He'd smiled at me with that crooked grin that had once made me forget my own phone number. And I'd felt 23 again, uncertain and infatuated and completely out of my depth. We talked for 3 hours. Derek had apologized for how our relationship had ended, admitting that he'd been immature and selfish and completely unprepared for the kind of commitment I'd deserved. He'd told me that leaving Minneapolis had been a mistake, that he'd spent the past 5 years trying to find something as real as what we'd had together. That first coffee had led to a second meeting, then a third. Derek had rented a small apartment across town while he worked on a local architectural project, and he'd made it clear that he'd returned to Minneapolis specifically to see if we could recapture what we'd once had together. He'd told me he'd never stopped loving me, that every relationship since ours had been a disappointing attempt to find what he'd foolishly given up. I'd been completely honest with Derek about my marriage, about how good Ryan was to me, and how guilty I felt about even meeting for coffee. But Derek had a way of making my concerns seem small and provincial, like I was limiting myself by staying in a relationship that was comfortable rather than passionate. Derek had asked me to leave Ryan, to give us a real chance to build something lasting, now that we were both older and more mature. He'd pointed out that I'd married Ryan on the rebound, that I'd never really processed the end of our relationship before jumping into something new. He'd suggested that what Ryan and I had was friendship rather than love, comfort rather than true partnership. The conversations with Derek had awakened feelings I'd thought were buried forever. The excitement of sneaking around, of having a secret that made ordinary moments feel charged with possibility, reminded me of how alive I'd felt during our original relationship. When Derek kissed me outside the coffee shop after our 4th meeting, it had felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. I was living a double life, and the worst part was how easy it had become to lie to the man who trusted me completely. I'd created elaborate explanations for my Saturday afternoon absences, invented friends who needed my support, and work projects that required extra attention. Ryan had never questioned my stories because lying to him had never occurred to him as a possibility. Derek had started pressuring me to make a decision. He'd accepted a permanent position with a Minneapolis architectural firm and wanted to know if I was serious about leaving my marriage to be with him. He'd pointed out that we weren't getting any younger, that if we were going to build a life together, we needed to stop sneaking around and make a real commitment to each other. I'd been planning to tell Ryan everything. I'd rehearsed the conversation dozens of times, trying to find words that would hurt him as little as possible, while still being honest about what I wanted. I'd convinced myself that Ryan deserved someone who was completely committed to him, rather than someone who was constantly wondering about what she'd given up. But before I could initiate that conversation, Ryan had found text messages from Derek on my phone. I'd been careless, leaving my phone on the kitchen counter while I showered. Ryan had never snooped through my personal things before, but apparently, Derek's name appearing repeatedly in my notifications had raised questions he couldn't ignore. By the time I'd gotten out of the shower, Ryan was sitting at our kitchen table with my phone in his hands and an expression I'd never seen before. The messages Ryan had read weren't explicitly inappropriate, but they were clearly from someone who knew me intimately, someone who shared inside jokes and referenced conversations that Ryan knew nothing about. Derek had written about missing me, about how right it felt to have me back in his life, about plans for a weekend trip that I obviously hadn't mentioned to my husband. Ryan had asked me directly who Derek was and why I was making secret plans with someone he'd never heard of. I'd tried to minimize the situation, explaining that Derek was an old friend who'd recently moved back to town and that I'd been helping him get settled. But Ryan wasn't stupid, and the tone of the messages made it clear that Derek was more than just a casual acquaintance. The fight that followed had been unlike anything in our 4-year marriage. Ryan, who never raised his voice, had been shouting about trust and honesty and the fundamental agreements that made marriage possible. I'd been defensive, accusing him of violating my privacy and jumping to conclusions based on innocent text messages. But as the argument escalated, I'd found myself saying things I'd never intended to reveal. I told Ryan that he was smothering me with his predictability, that I felt trapped in a life that was more like a comfortable prison than a partnership. I'd accused him of being content with mediocrity, of never challenging me or inspiring me to be anything more than his devoted wife. Ryan had looked stunned by my accusations, like I'd been speaking a foreign language. He'd pointed out that he'd spent 4 years trying to make me happy, that he'd built his entire life around what he thought we both wanted. He'd asked when I'd started feeling this way, why I'd never talked to him about being unhappy instead of carrying on secret relationships with other men. That's when I'd exploded with the truth that destroyed everything. In my anger and frustration, I'd screamed that he'd never been my first choice, that I'd only married him because Derek had been unavailable, that he'd been nothing more than a backup plan until someone better came along. The truth I'd hidden for 4 years exploded out of me like a bomb I couldn't defuse. Ryan had gone completely still, processing what I'd revealed with a calmness that was more terrifying than any emotional outburst could have been. He'd asked me to repeat what I'd said, and when I'd tried to take it back, he'd simply shaken his head. Ryan had told me that he finally understood why our marriage had always felt slightly off balance, why I'd never seemed completely present even during our happiest moments. He'd said that nobody could fake the kind of feelings I'd just expressed, that my outburst had revealed something fundamental about how I'd always seen our relationship. Within 24 hours, Ryan had filed for divorce and moved out of our house. He'd handled the practical aspects of our separation with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else, arranging for movers and changing his address and informing both our families that our marriage was over. The speed of his decision had shocked everyone who knew us. Ryan's parents, who treated me like their own daughter, had called to ask what had happened. My own family had been devastated, especially my mother, who'd always praised me for finding such a stable, loving husband. When people asked for details, I'd found myself unable to explain without revealing my own role in destroying our marriage. Ryan had been generous in the divorce settlement, more generous than I'd deserved. He'd insisted I keep the house we'd bought together, along with most of our shared belongings. His lawyer had structured the agreement to ensure I'd be financially stable, even though I'd been the one to destroy our marriage. Even in his anger and disappointment, Ryan had been trying to take care of me. The irony of his kindness had been crushing. Here was a man who'd loved me enough to prioritize my well-being, even after discovering I'd never truly loved him back, and I'd thrown that away for someone who'd already proven he couldn't be trusted with my heart. Because that's exactly what had happened with Derek. When I'd gone to Derek's apartment to tell him that I was finally free to be with him, I'd expected celebration, relief, maybe even a proposal. Instead, I'd found a man who'd gone pale at the news that I'd actually left my husband for him. Derek had started talking about timing and complications, about how he hadn't expected things to move so fast. Derek ran again, just like he always did, leaving me with nothing but the ashes of the life I'd destroyed for him. Within a week of my marriage ending, he'd informed me that he'd decided to take a position with a firm in San Francisco after all. He'd said that maybe we could stay in touch, see how things developed once the dust settled from my divorce. But I'd heard this speech before. Derek's promises had always been vague, his commitments conditional on circumstances that never seemed to align properly. He'd wanted the excitement of an affair, the validation of knowing he could still have me, but he'd never actually wanted the responsibility of building a real relationship. I'd been left with nothing, no husband, no lover, no future that looked anything like what I'd imagined for myself just a month earlier. The house that had been our dream home felt like a mausoleum of my failed marriage, filled with furniture Ryan and I had chosen together, and photos of a happiness I'd destroyed through my own selfishness and stupidity. The worst part was watching Ryan move on with his life. Through mutual friends, I'd learned that he'd started dating someone new just 3 months after our divorce was finalized. Sarah was a colleague from his firm, someone who'd apparently had feelings for him for years, but had never acted on them while he was married. The photos I'd seen of them together showed Ryan smiling in a way I'd never seen. Completely relaxed, genuinely happy, free from the underlying tension that had apparently characterized our entire relationship. Ryan had found someone who chose him first, someone who didn't need to be convinced of his worth or persuaded to commit to their future together. Sarah looked at him the way he'd always looked at me, and seeing their obvious happiness had forced me to confront the magnitude of what I'd lost. My friends had been sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. Most of them had loved Ryan and couldn't understand how I'd managed to destroy such a solid marriage. The few who'd known about my dissatisfaction had assumed I'd been smart enough to work on my relationship, rather than abandoning it for a fantasy that had predictably fallen apart. The professional consequences had been almost as devastating as the personal ones. Ryan and I had shared a social circle built around his work colleagues and their spouses, and my absence from company events had been noted and discussed. My own career had suffered as I'd struggled to maintain focus while my personal life imploded around me. The loneliness had been crushing. I'd spent 4 years as part of a couple, planning a future with someone who genuinely loved me, and now I was starting over at 28 with nothing to show for my marriage except a house full of memories and a reputation as someone who couldn't appreciate what she had. Late at night, I'd find myself scrolling through old photos of Ryan and me, trying to pinpoint the moment when I'd started taking his love for granted. He'd been everything a woman should want in a partner: faithful, supportive, genuinely interested in my happiness, and I'd convinced myself that those qualities were boring rather than precious. I'd spent 4 years treating my marriage like a safety net, not realizing I was married to the man who would have caught me if I'd ever truly fallen. Ryan had loved me unconditionally, building his entire life around our partnership, while I'd been secretly keeping one foot out the door in case something more exciting came along. The regret had been eating me alive for months now. Not just regret about losing Ryan, but regret about the person I'd become during our marriage, someone who'd been so focused on what she wasn't experiencing that she'd completely missed the value of what she had. I'd been married to a genuinely good man who deserved so much better than a wife who'd been settling for him while fantasizing about someone else. If this story made you think about what really matters in relationships, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And I'm curious, what city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever taken someone's love for granted and lost them? Sometimes we don't realize what we have until it's gone. Share your thoughts about the difference between passion and real love, and I'll see you in the next story.